Well, a very warm welcome back, all my vintage dirt bike loving YouTubers, and thanks to you all once more for tuning in to my classic dirt bike TV channel. Now, I hope over the last 6 months or so you've found something to keep you entertained here on my channel with regards looking at old classic dirt bikes and some old classic racing videos. So I hope I'm doing something to keep up your spirits before hopefully we all get back racing this year sometime. So I'll certainly look out for some of my subscribers in the paddock if I bump into one or two of you in 2021. Okay, coming up in my next video, I've selected another batch of very nice looking bikes from around my paddock walkabouts over the last few years. So there's some very interesting machines in this particular video. So without further ado, let's just jump straight into our first machine. Okay, our first race bike is this 1980 YZ250 Yamaha belonging to Martin Reed, and this is certainly quite a nice original looking example of one of these iconic race bikes. Now, if you were a racer in 1980 and you were in the market for a 250, then this was certainly the bike to have. Now, this motor was a sweet little power plant, and these weren't too quick at the bottom end, but once this 250 hit the mid-range, it was a white knuckle ride, that's for sure. But it had a good motor and of course quite good suspension as well. Now, these yellow tanked YZs with the black graphics were mainly aimed at the overseas markets, whereas the white YZs with the red and black graphics were sold mainly in Europe. Now, the front 38mm Kayaba forks gave just short of 12 inches of travel, but there wasn't really much scope for adjustment on these forks, but you could add or remove air through the Schrader valves on top of each fork leg. Although overall these YZ250Gs were great little race bikes because they had quite good suspension on the front and rear. They had a stonking two-stroke motor that was like a ballistic missile when it got fired up, but these 250Gs would set the benchmark for other YZs to follow in the years to come, and for a bike from 1980 there simply was nothing better. Now, from a top of the class YZ to an old timer from the swinging 1960s, and this is Scott Remington's lovely BSA Gold Star. Now, these old Gold Stars were often seen as a real man's scrambler, mainly because they were quite heavy and cumbersome to throw around the racetrack. Although, having said that, if it was grunt that you were after on your old vintage racer, then these big, long stroking single cylinder Gold Star engines had it in absolute truckloads. But these old Goldies take you back to the days when you could watch the pride of Britain's best racers up to their armpits in mud, when you would watch the BBC Grandstand Winter Scrambles live on TV on a Saturday afternoon, and you had bikes like this old Gold Star along with Triumphs and Greaves and other makes of machines entertaining the huge crowds that were lined along the track side. But don't let the looks of this old classic fool you. These are still seriously quick bikes. Okay, maybe they're not built for quick handling or agility into the corners, but on a wide open racetrack, this Goldie will certainly be able to hold her own against much more modern machinery. And you can actually see this old Gold Star in action on the racetrack just by checking out my video of the racing from the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's Round 7 event from Penrith in 2019, and you'll be able to see Scott ride the wheels off this old bike. But for me personally, it's still good to see these old Gold Stars taking part in vintage racing, as there are not many of them still being used as scramblers these days, as many vintage racers tend to go for the more popular BSA B40 motors, which are of course lighter and a bit easier to maintain. But what this old girl lacks in being light and nimble, she certainly makes up for in the horsepower stakes, and she will no doubt pack a punch when you snap the throttle open on that big 500cc motor. But for me personally, a lovely old vintage classic. Okay, next up we have another quite nice bike from the Kenny Harper collection, and this is just another one of Kenny's twin port CZs. Now, I'm not entirely sure here, but I think this is a 360 bike, but of course feel free to correct me on that point if you think I've made a statement in error there, because I never actually got to speak to Kenny on the day that I grabbed these clips, but it's a cracking looking little bike, that's for sure. Now, those twin exhaust pipes are of course pattern replacements for the originals, although I'd always thought that these low slung pipes were quite a strange place to mount them, being so low underneath the engine, where they would get damaged easily with stones and other debris, but it certainly never seemed to be a problem for many of the CZ Works riders back in the day when they were winning world championships on these twin port race machines. But these 360 twin porter engines were very good power plants with their unique single cylinder and those twin exhaust header pipes. And these old Czechoslovakian racers are still hugely popular nowadays as a classic or vintage race bike. And when you just wander around the race paddocks these days, there's always seems to be an abundance of these kind of bikes taking part in classic racing, and that just speaks volumes about their performance and reliability, and just how suitable these bikes are for racing even in this modern day. But I'm pretty sure that this is not an original CZ bike from back in the day, as very few of them are nowadays. And as I said, I never actually got to speak to Kenny on the day, so I've no idea just what year this bike is or what's been done to it, but I can see that he's not had the usual gear shift upgrade done on this motor, which is quite a common replacement on these kind of engines. But it's still a quite nice little bike with that alloy tank, the twin port engine, and of course those twin silencers at the rear. And Kenny's even still kept the original Zhikov carburetor, which is quite unusual, as most owners tend to make this the very first part that they change on these old CZ bikes. But nevertheless, this will certainly make a nice addition to Kenny's classic motorcycle collection, and it will sit quite nicely alongside his other CZ bikes, and of course the many Spanish Bultacos that Kenny owns. And I'm sure it must be a bit of a headache for Kenny working out which of his bikes to take to his next classic or vintage scramble race event. Okay, next up, time to look at another old classic, and this is Angus Gilliland's Royal Enfield racer. Now again, this example is most definitely another one of those Frankenstein concoctions that Angus has bolted together in his workshop. Now the engine is almost certainly based around the old 1960s Royal Enfield Bullet 500, although the frame looks like a bit of a mystery to me, but still appears to have a similar geometry to the Royal Enfield chassis, although it's maybe that all of the bike's road going tinware has been removed, and that's what makes the bike look different. But the front forks and rear suspension is from a different and more modern machine. Now these big long stroking 500cc Enfield engines were big, powerful beasties back in the day, not unlike of course the big Gold Star that we saw previously, and as I remember, these I think had a 4-speed gearbox and the usual wet multi-plate clutch. Now I'm certainly no expert on these big Enfield motors, but from what I can divulge, they were very powerful and reasonably reliable. But it was a big lump of an engine, that's for sure, and this motor has been in production for many years that I can remember of, and even variations of this engine are still being produced in Royal Enfield Bullet road bikes, which of course are still being manufactured in India. But of course that's the beauty of these vintage dirt bikes, because when you attend a classic or old style race event, you just never know what you're going to come across next, and this old Enfield Bullet, I have to say, is one of the very first that I've ever seen taking part in a scrambles event, and there we can see Angus making some last minute adjustments to his Royal Enfield before it takes to the track, and he was actually saying that he wasn't too worried about the reliability of the bike, but he just wondered if the rider would go the distance. But again, this bike just shows you about all you need to go classic racing. You don't need to spend tens of thousands of pounds to buy the latest Rickman Triumph or CCM bike, because if you've got an old road bike that's never going to be used on the highway again, just strip it down to its bare essentials, and as long as it passes scrutineering on the day, then you can take it racing and have loads of fun in the process. Although looking at this old dog certainly reminds me of the days when I used to turn my old BSA Bantams into scramblers, when you would just ditch all the lights and the mudguards and all the other road going parts until you were left with basically just the bare bones of a frame and an engine, and of course the front and rear suspension. Then you could just head off to the nearest field and have some fun. And I think this was Angus's idea here, was just to build a bike with what he had lying about in the workshop and then take it to the racing. Okay, next up, another real man's motocrosser, and this is the late Ian Robertson's YZ490 Yamaha, which I think could be a 1985 model, but then again, don't quote me on that particular fact. Now again, these 490 Yamahas were just simply awesome pieces of kit, and they were of course made famous by Brock Glover, who won the AMA 500 Championship in 1985 on a similar works version of this bike. Now the problems with these 490 motors and their sometimes dodgy suspension systems are quite well documented, but once you had the motor jetted just right and then sorted out that rear suspension, this was still a very good bike and very quick as well. But first introduced back in 1982 as a replacement for that magical YZ465 bike, and riders did complain that these were much heavier than the 465. They weren't as reliable, and some say they were even a bit of a pig to start and could vibrate your teeth from your gums if you weren't prepared to put the time in and sort things out in the engine department. But I have to say that just looking at Ian's bike here, just standing in the paddock, it looks like a race winner just even standing still. But of course we sadly lost Ian to a very tragic accident back in 2019, which wasn't motorcycle related, I might add, but this certainly brings back some nice memories again, seeing Ian's old YZ490 race bike lined up here in the paddock for another race outing. Now, we couldn't have a paddock video without featuring another classic CCM, and this bike is Ian Stainton's race bike. Now, I'm pretty sure this is not an original Alan Clues machine from the 1970s, as it's getting harder and harder these days to find original examples of those iconic British classics, although the good news is that there are a few companies now remanufacturing replica versions of these CCMs, and I'm sure Ian's featured machine is just one of those items. Now, there are companies like Joe Maxwell Engineering who will supply you with a replica 1974 chassis to build your own bike, or if you've had a small lottery win, then you can just get Joe to build you a complete 1974 replica bike that's authentic in every detail from that original 1974 design. But a nice pair of heavy duty foot pegs and hangers here that Ian's bolted on to his Alan Clues engine, as this of course was a trademark of many of Alan Clues' designs, was to bolt the footrest straight onto the casings rather than the conventional method of welding them onto the chassis. But as I said, things like fuel tanks and seats and plastics and just about every other part that you would need are quite easily available if you want to tackle your very own CCM build project, although complete engines are maybe not just as easy to source, and of course it was all down to the great Alan Clues himself, who turned the standard BSA B50 motor into an off-road competition winner, and of course it went on to make household names of the likes of the great Jimmy Aird, Bob Wright and Norman Barrow, and many other CCM riders who raced these bikes for the factory way back in the day. Okay, just to finish off this Volume 5 edition of our paddock videos, we're going to take a look at Mike van der Meer's quite nice 1988 Honda CR250 Evolution bike. Now, these 88 CR250s are without doubt certainly up there with some of the best motocross race bikes that Honda ever built, which is quite ironic in a way when you consider that Mr. Honda all those years ago made that very bold statement saying that the Honda motorcycle company would never ever build a two-stroke engine, although of course he was soon made to eat his words when he saw what Kawasaki, Suzuki and Yamaha were all doing with two-stroke engines and the millions of sales that they were generating. So of course he had to get on board pretty quickly or be left behind by the competition. Now, these 88 250s were excellent bikes, and they had a few improvements over the previous 87 machine. The bike of course had Honda's Pro Link suspension system, which worked slightly better than the 87 bike, but it could be a bit harsh and punishing for the rider on bumpy tracks. Now, the front forks on the 88 bike weren't the best, and riders still say that they were just too light on compression and maybe even too heavy on rebound, and they could bottom out quite easily. But this still was just an inconvenience at best, because the rest of the bike was still a pretty good racing package. But this Pro Link rear suspension and alloy swing arm again was okay, but if the rear shock wasn't up to it, the back end could certainly bounce around. But this 250 Honda engine was just a peach of a power plant. It was quick, it was reliable, and it would rev to the moon and back if you wanted it to do it. And it also had a reed valve intake and of course Honda's HPP power valve system, or Honda Power Port if you want to give it its full handle. But for a 1988 CR250 Honda, this was a superb racing machine, and certainly a bike to have for that particular year. Now, hydraulic disc brakes, of course, for 1988, and these front stoppers did a very good job of slowing down this red rocket. But overall, these CR250s were a very good package, because what the bike had, it did very well, and it was a kind of bike that would suit club racers and professionals alike. And if you didn't want to go fast and just enjoy a day out on your Evo race bike, then this bike would certainly do that. But if you were an adrenaline motocross junkie that just wanted your machine to fly into outer space, then this CR250 would accommodate you in that department as well. But this example of Mike van der Meers is a lovely bike, and you can see why these Evo racers are so popular with riders these days, because not only are they quick bikes to ride, they're pretty good looking into the bargain. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that latest collection of bikes from around the paddock. Some very nice looking machines in there, and a couple of old timers as well, but nevertheless quite a good collection of old racers. Now, coming up in my next video, I'm going to post some racing footage from the Vets MXD Nations event at Farleigh Castle. Now, I used to film this event on a regular basis way back in the day, and I think I've got about 4 years worth of footage in my library somewhere, so we're going to post 2 or 3 videos from Farleigh Castle in my next couple of video postings, so I do hope you'll join me for that. Okay, until the next time, everybody, continue to be positive, and we'll certainly get back racing this year sometime, hopefully. So until then, we'll speak again when we all get back together here on Classic Dirt Bike TV.